When he first began to publish poems, Seamus Heaney's chosen pseudonym was Incertus, meaning not sure of himself. Characteristically, this was a subtle irony. His early prominence was based on his sure-footed sense of his own direction and his formidable poetic strengths. It was also based on a respect for his readers, which won their trust. Heaney was born in Northern Ireland in 1939, grew up among the nods, winks and repressions of a deeply divided society, and saw those fissures break open into violence. He knew the North, as residents of the Irish Republic, called the 6 northeastern counties. He targeted it, eviscerated it, and eventually left it to live in the South. His background has been immortalised in his early poems: a small Derry farmhouse, a cattle-dealing father, a much-loved mother and aunt presiding over the domestic world. There's a Proustian exactness in his evocation of his early life, the unerring memory for the illustration on a tin of condiments, or the name of an obscure piece of machinery. He could also mock this aspect of his reputation. On a visit to the Tam O'Shanter Experience at Robert Burns's birthplace, he was teased that one day there would be a Seamus Heaney experience. "That's right," he replied. "It'll be a few churns and a confessional box." He was marked out early by his cleverness and progressed from the local primary schools to life as a boarder in St. Colum's College in Derry at 12 years old. "I began as a poet," he later remarked, "when my roots were crossed with my reading." The college's education gave a good grounding in Latin, but also exposure to the English poetic tradition. His first poetic passion was Gerard Manley Hopkins, which he showed in the lush wordplay of poems he wrote during his time at Queen's University, Belfast. From Queen's, he trained as a school teacher and rapidly attracted attention. The Inspector of Schools appointed him lecturer in English at St. Joseph's College of Education. An academic life seemed on the cards, and in 1966, Heaney joined the Faculty of English at Queen's University. The cultural atmosphere of Belfast in the early 1960s is hard to recapture. Given what happened in 1969 when communal violence broke out and the British Army moved in, images of a calm before the storm are inescapable. But it didn't always seem like that at the time. Patterns of sectarian discrimination ran deep, and the representatives of state power were blatantly and often oppressively Protestant. The Queen's University of the 1960s certainly represented the Unionist governing class and was seen by some as a kind of colonial outpost. A large proportion of its teaching staff were British, and many returned to the mainland when teaching terms were over. At the same time, the underlying realities of his native province were grist to Heaney's mill. A poem called Lint Water was published in the Times Literary Supplement on the 5th of August 1965. The Ulster industry of linen making provided a metaphor for the poisoning of running water. Northern Irish readers would be well aware that historically linen making was sectarian in its work patterns. Putrid currents floated trout to the loch, their bellies white as linen tablecloths. The idea of a poisoned terrain was both irresistible and significant. So is the powerful authorial stamp of the poem, which signals the way Heaney would approach and unpick the tensions of his native province. His own family's relations with neighbouring Protestant farmers were amicable. There was a sense of difference rather than superiority. The poems Heaney was planting out in Irish newspapers and magazines in the early 1960s made him a name to watch. He was one of an extraordinarily talented group of Belfast-based writers who came together to discuss their work under the aegis of the academic and poet Philip Hobsbawm. They included the novelist and short story writer Bernard McCreadie and the poet Michael Longley. In 1965, Heaney married the dazzling Mary Devlin. She was beautiful and clever, a teacher and editor, and as strong-minded as himself. The Heaney household was a centre of gregarious social life. There were parties, music sessions, and the constant to and fro of neighbours, visiting poets and writers. Heaney's explosive sense of humour and legendary hospitality created warmth and life, but he was simultaneously putting in hard work at poetry, often late at night. In a student magazine of 1961, he described himself as an ex-poet, but now he was committed to his craft. His breakthrough to a wider audience than Belfast came early. On the 19th of May 1966, Faber and Faber, the premier British publishing house for poetry, published Death of a Naturalist. It cost 18 shillings. While the subject matter was pastoral, Ulster style, the tone was not. The language was arresting and even violent. Blackberries are bloody, jars full of cream or pottery bombs. Above all, in the opening poem, Digging, the poet's pen nestles in his fist, snug as a gun. The poems were ferociously accomplished. Along with images of violence, themes of decay and infestation recur. There are reflections on Irish history, including the potato famine of the 1840s, and a brutal portrait of a Protestant proletarian in the poem Docker. That fist would drop a hammer on a Catholic. Oh yes, that kind of thing could start again. The only Roman collar he tolerates smiles all round his sleek pint of porter. Perhaps the most powerful poem in the book is Mid-Term Break, a deceptively simple recollection of his younger brother's death in a road accident outside the family home when the 14-year-old Heaney was away at boarding school. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him, for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Heaney wrote the poem in February 1963, sitting in an armchair in his shared flat, waiting for a flatmate to cook supper. The poet Michael Longley would refer to these early poems as little miracles. The last poem in Death of a Naturalist was dedicated to Longley. Personal Helicon. As a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it, and one was scaresome, for there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection. Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare, big-eyed Narcissus, into some spring, is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Death of a Naturalist was widely reviewed by major critics and won 4 prizes, including the Somerset Maugham Award. The book sold well for a first poetry collection, but more significantly, it created a following which would grow. Heaney's public profile was coming into focus. Personal charisma had something to do with it, and an ability to read his own work to riveting effect. But these were secondary to a poetic voice which connected immediately with what many Irish people knew: a rural past slipping away, a violent and traumatic history. Reading him, they felt they were in good hands. That voice was also heard and understood by readers far beyond Ireland, not only for its humanity and generosity of vision, but also its ability to craft language with an unerring economy and to hit on the unexpected yet utterly appropriate word. What I was after, he would later recall, was a way of making the central tradition of English poetry which we'd observed in college and university absorb our own particular eccentric experience. Many of the poems in Heaney's second collection were written before the violent assault on civil rights marchers which sparked off the Northern Crisis in 1968. But the volume is full of epiphanies which read prophetically. It ends with Bogland, a metaphor for the memory of historical violence. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up, an astounding crate full of air. Butter, sunk under more than 100 years, was recovered salty and white. The ground itself is kind, black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here, only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. Our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet centre is bottomless. Heaney's notebooks for 1969 show a preoccupation with history, particularly the 1798 Rising, when a Republican enterprise briefly brought Northern Presbyterians and Catholic radicals together. His poem about the Rising, Requiem for the Croppies, closed with a powerful image of barley seeds buried with the slaughtered rebels and sprouting from the ground a year later. With the British Army on the streets of Belfast and the birth of the IRA, this could look like an invocation of blood sacrifice, and Heaney stopped reading the poem in public performances. The question of the public stance of the poet became pressing. He was a supporter of the civil rights movement and fiercely conscious of the injustices under which Catholics lived, but he wasn't actively involved in politics. For the Catholic writer, he remarked 10 years later, "I think the Troubles were a critical moment. The blueprint in his head predicted that history would fulfill itself in a united Ireland or something. These are very fundamental blueprints." Heaney's own blueprint was to emerge as less cut and dried than this, and he was unprepared to see violence as a necessary preliminary to any political outcome.